Hello and welcome to this Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office Lunch and Learn presentation. I'm Christina Wyckoff. I'm the Section 106 Coordinator and Historical Archaeologist at the Oklahoma SHPO. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Fortney. Dr. Fortney is a professor of history at Dallas College. And today his presentation will be Robert M. Jones, a Choctaw Millionaire in the American South, 1808 to 1873. Thank you so much, Dr. Fortney. I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much. And I do just want to get started by offering my gratitude to the Oklahoma SHPO office, Oklahoma Historical Society for the invite to do the presentation today, and for all of you for taking your lunch and attending. So what I'm going to be talking about today is my book project, which is currently by this title, Robert M. Jones, Choctaw Millionaire in the American South. You have this picture here of Jones and his second wife, Susan Colbert. I think it'd be helpful to give a little bit of background on how I got started on this topic. Way back when I was doing my history MA long ago, I was sitting in a class and I remember picking up a book on, it was Cherokee slaveholders. And this jumped out to me right away as strange. And I remember saying to my professor, wait, natives as slaveholders, this contradicts everything that I know about natives. And he tactfully said to me, he asked the valid question, well, what is it that you actually know about natives and not what you suspect or have heard or maybe stereotype? And the true answer to that was, oh, nothing, virtually nothing. This sparked in me a desire to learn more about the topic of native slaveholding, but indigenous peoples in general. When I did a little bit of digging around, I found that Choctaw slaveholding at this time had not really been covered much by historians, and so I decided to do my MA thesis on Choctaw slaveholders. While doing the thesis, I gathered some of the more traditional sources, census records, some missionary records, hit up Oklahoma Historical Society, Western History Collection, and put something together, but it was painfully obvious, and it's painful for those who read it now, my knowledge of indigenous peoples was still quite low, and that was hindering my ability to address this topic. So I ended up at University of Oklahoma wanting to pursue this in much greater depth. While at University of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey approached the history department looking for a historian to give a little bit of context to a dig that they were doing at Rose Hill, one of Jones's plantations. Somehow this ended up getting passed to me. Maybe it was the thought of 10 hours in Oklahoma in July outside at a place where people definitely were dying from malaria. But so I started doing a little bit of digging. I already knew Jones's name from my earlier work. And what I knew is that he was ubiquitous within the literature. However, most accounts that I saw, they gave the same set of basic facts about him. They had the 500 plus slaves and 4 plus plantations. Nobody could really settle on the exact number there. That he was a millionaire and not adjusted for inflation millionaire, like a full millionaire in his own time. That he served in the Confederate Congress and that he died in despair in the wake of Reconstruction. Now, finding these things that others had published, it raised questions for me about slaveholding and the importance among the Choctaw people. Motivations for aligning with the Confederacy during the Civil War. Was it as simple as the slavery connection? I right away jumped out, I was like, wait, that's a lost cause narrative. How is it that he is being plugged into this lost cause? And then the bigger one is, why isn't he better known? I mean, he shows up and some books do end up giving a paragraph here, a paragraph there. He becomes a character. But as far as works that were just dedicated to him, it was really one article in Chronicles of Oklahoma in the 80s. So this started as a mystery that I could not quite ignore. I couldn't quite put down. I quickly figured out that part of the reason he's not better known is that we know from a couple of sources that a lot of his records were kept in Rose Hill and burned with the mansion in 1913. And so it was difficult to put his life together. But as I started digging deeper, I kept uncovering more facts, and every fact that I found raised a new question. So as I put these together, as I was writing my dissertation, which became more about Choctaw Nation building than about slaveholding itself, I used Jones and these facts as my opening and close of each chapter. So he attended Choctaw Academy. So I was able to talk about Choctaw views on education, that he profited and suffered mightily in removal. This allowed me to kind of take a different approach on uncomfortable narratives. That he created this trade monopoly. A lot of the practices that he's using, these vertical and horizontal integrations, these are things that you think about Gilded Age robber barons. How is he doing this? But also, what does it tell me about Choctaws and the market economy and the way that their economy was structured? Enslaved people, numbers are very much closer to 350 to 400. What about the experience of enslaved people among Native societies? It's a much more difficult story to tell, and there have been some that have come out and done this much more, but at the time of my dissertation, this was me digging into it. The Confederate Alliance, was this alliance, was this allegiance? What motivated Jones to be involved? In telling that story, I could drag the Civil War to the West. I could also complicate what's literally a black-white narrative by adding in more Native perspective on it. The fact that he very much recovered in a lot of ways in Reconstruction belies what was given before and challenges this lost cause narrative. And then finally, my goodness, does his life have a lot of twists and turns. It dates me a little bit to say, but a lot of this felt like a Lifetime movie going through a life filled with a lot of tragedy, a lot of scandal, his businesses burning down, blowing up, ships sinking, the idea that he might have been poisoned, that shootouts taking place between his children, all of this, it was scintillating details. So I wrote that as my dissertation. And as you might believe, most of the things that the committee wanted to talk about was, wait, tell me more on this Jones person. Why can't you answer these questions here? When I would think about, okay, do I want to convert this to a book? Every publisher was like, Jones is the book. That's the part that people want to hear more about. He's the lens to tell the story that I want to tell. But to do it, it meant expanding my source base. So these are just a small section of where I ended up having to go to try to find Jones's life, to basically go everywhere where there was a rumor of a needle within every haystack I could find. So letters received at the Office of Indian Affairs, that's that pleasant 900 rolls of microfilm that are done by agency, but reading through all of that to try to find, there's a couple letters from him, but more, where is he mentioned? Newspapers, much better historians than I am, have tried to put together Jones's life, but I have a couple of tools that they didn't, in that so many more newspapers are digitized. And so I found him in places that you wouldn't expect, so you wouldn't take the time to look. Land records, some related to Native, some not. Military records. Other correspondence, the low-hanging fruit was, of course, Peter Pitchland's collections. He has thousands of letters, a couple dozen from Jones. Choctaw Nation papers, a lot of their legal records. He shows up as Esquire quite a little bit. Journals, several were kind enough to share with me some journals, and Jones is a character in them. His corporate partnerships. A lot of what he did required articles of incorporation, and found those in random places. The Detroit Public Library has his original articles of incorporation with Joseph Berthollet. Past and present historians who have done just incredible work, going back to Muriel Wright and the efforts that she took to record evidence from elders who had met Jones. Present historians who are constantly putting out better and better works that Jones becomes a part of. And then Jones's family remaining. Bob Love was kind enough to have a phone call conversation with me and set me straight on some things and pushed me to a couple of things. That was great. And then Choctaw people themselves, a lot of times in online communities. Jennifer Myers was amazing in going through genealogical stuff. Francine Locke Bray, Sandra Riley, Tammy Jones, many others who I'm sure I'm forgetting, who have been incredibly helpful and generous with their time in untangling some of these mysteries and helping me put together a much more compelling story. So main takeaways that I draw from, and I promise this will be the only time I read to you. Jones as an entrepreneur, as an enslaver, as a diplomat, that he played a pivotal role in these areas in the Choctaw Nation, but also in the larger historical 19th century South. Jones was not confined within the nation, neither were the Choctaw people, but he's everywhere within the region. By looking at his career, we're able to see a story about how economic development tied to institution building and protections of sovereignty. And finally, Jones acted in Choctaw's interests, and this is the huge caveat, as he understood them. That's a really big one. But it's also really important to really confront the fact that he rose to affluence through the self-interest and through exploitation of others, including hundreds of enslaved people. It's easy for, when you write biography, it's easy, I don't want to say to fall in love with your subject, but to start excusing, start justifying a lot of the things that they did. You get to know their life pretty closely. I once gave a presentation, and one of the audience members, a Chickasaw person, in the question and answer, we talked a little bit, and he said to me a quote that always stuck with me. He was talking about Jones. He said, well, he did a lot of great things, but he was also kind of a bastard. And it very much stuck that, I mean, bastard or not, he carved an important role for himself within the Choctaw Nation and the American South. And so that's part of the story that I tell. The book is divided into three clear sections, 2 chapters on the age of removal, 3 on this rebuilding and rise to prominence, and then 2 on Civil War and Reconstruction. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick a chapter at random, and then I'm going to read it to you very slowly, verbatim, in like a Bob Ross voice that's guaranteed to push it. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry, I've been to presentations where that's happened before. I would log out if I was the one doing that. No, what I plan to do is for each of these chapters, I'm going to try to give you basically the SparkNotes version of them, a little sampling of some of the things that are covered, about 5 minutes each. If I'm running long, I'll end up cutting Commerce 1, or Diplomacy 1. But you can always email me afterwards. I'm happy to have more conversations on this topic anytime, but I want to save some time for question and answer. So just a sampling of each chapter as I go through. So, coming of age in the age of removal. I have to say that uncovering Jones's roots, this is an exercise in head spinning, desk slamming, head slamming on desk futility a lot of the times. I mean, if you're familiar with the meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia of Charlie sitting in front of with all these papers everywhere and all these lines going everywhere, and it's just craziness. That's what I often felt like trying to put these things together, find out what his roots really were. For over a century, generations of historians and genealogists uncovered certain clues, certain facts, promising leads into his background. But a lot of times they raised more questions than they ended up answering. And it's especially frustrating because he kept really good records on his immediate family. He recorded the births and sadly the deaths of his children, the marriages that he had had, and a lot of his marriage records exist. His children's marriages as well. He had them in a family Bible that's currently housed in the Oklahoma Historical Society. But for him, even some of his basic family history is convoluted. During removal, and after removal especially, he's everywhere in the documentary record. Local chiefs and their subordinate captains, they knew him. U.S. officials, agents, merchants, missionaries, they all seem to have connections to him. Prior, the record is so much more scant. But what is available, thankfully, gives us all clues, an available view into Choctaw society in what Craig O'Brien would call in a revolutionary age. By the time of removal, it's not an accident that we see Robert Jones as a young man in his early 20s, as someone who has experience in plantation management and raising cattle, that he has an advanced education. A lot of this came down to a Choctaw-driven effort at trying to reshape aspects of society, but also to groom the upcoming generation of leadership in a way to better resist American expansion and prevent removal. So some of the details from this that can come out. Jones was born into a split family, and he ended up part of his childhood with each. He spoke Choctaw and English both as first languages. He says from as soon as he could speak, he spoke both. His father was most likely John, or he went by Johnny Jones, who lived on the eastern edge of the Choctaw Nation. He had come in as a trader. You can still find Jones Bluff is there. His mother's name we don't know, which is especially frustrating because we know 4 of her sisters for sure. We know that she died around the 18 teens and his father remarried. When his father remarried, he went to live with his aunt, Molly McDonald, keeping with Choctaw matrilineal customs. So from these sisters, we know that 2 of them only had paternal ties to Jones's mother, but Jones still regarded them very much fully as his family. He talked about both of them as his aunts, and their children he referred to as his brothers. His full aunts, the one that was most important to him in his life was Molly McDonald. If that name is not familiar to you, she's been covered rather extensively. I definitely point out Don Peterson's book on Indians in the Family does an excellent job with her and James McDonald. Fantastic book. So I won't get too much into that. But Jones went and lived on the other side of the Choctaw Nation with Molly. Molly's son, or she had 2 sons. Her younger son, 10 years Jones's elder, was James McDonald. Again, been covered relatively extensively, and this is the portrait him, first bar certified Native attorney. James very much took on not just a brotherly, but also something of a paternal role with Jones. He ensured that he was able to receive a basic education, first at a missionary school, and then he put him into a boarding school outside of Jackson, Mississippi, so that Jones could still be at Molly's plantation and try to gather some of his own resources. After a couple of years, James tried to get money to get Robert into college. Couldn't get that. Instead, he did get him funded to go to Choctaw Academy. That's in the background of this picture here. You have the remains of one of the buildings. Choctaw Academy has now, yes, been covered quite well. If you have not looked up Christina Snyder's Great Crossings, again, just fantastic book that gives you the background on Choctaw Academy. What I will say for this is that Jones returned from Choctaw Academy, letter of recommendation personally from future VP Richard M. Johnson in hand, feeling empowered, feeling like he said that he had a plan to stop removal. It's like, okay, that obviously didn't happen, maybe too empowered, but a foot in multiple worlds, understanding the market economy, understanding racial slavery. This was not something that others had fully imposed. This was mostly led by a Choctaw effort. Moving on for removal. Choctaw removal was undoubtedly a pivotal point in Jones's life, but also a pivotal point in his ascendancy. But his role in it had been deliberately obscured. Enamored with this idea of a very rich Indian, early Oklahoma historians and hobbyists alike, they fawned for details on how Jones could have acquired such wealth. One of the sources that comes out came from 1930s WPA, when historians were putting together the Indian Pioneer Papers. 2 of the interviews were done with those who were descendants of those who knew Jones well. So the son of an overseer and the daughter of a housekeeper. They have scant but really precise details on how Jones got his money. They both say that he got either $1,000 or $1,800 in past annuity payments that had been kept by a guardian or a missionary, and this became the seed money to start his business empire after removal. This story made it into the history books for decades, and it still shows up in Oklahoma textbooks. I'm quite certain it's a lie. And I'm quite certain that Jones himself likely told that lie. Now, as historian Josh Piker has said in The 4 Deaths of Acorn Whistler, the stories convey truth, story conveys lies. Many stories, of course, do both. I'm convinced that Jones started the story himself to conceal part of his role within removal. The discrepancies just keep adding up the more that I looked in it. Jones definitely suffered the trauma of removal, but it's also impossible to deny that he gained a good amount of capital from the process. It gives us this uncomfortable perspective. So how is he gaining money? he says that he was active in the treaty negotiations at Dancing Rabbit Creek. This he could have been propping himself up for. All likely, he stood in James's shadow for a lot of this. But at Dancing Rabbit Creek in the Supplement Treaty, he was awarded a floating section of land and then another half-floating section of land. These floating sections you could place almost anywhere on Choctaw lands and then sell for cash to American buyers. Now, a lot of people fell within that. What Jones did that was more, the more that I looked, is Jones laid claim to over 1,600 additional acres that he had claimed the right to sell, sold, and eventually profited the money from them. Beyond that, he also accepted numerous positions within the United States government, facilitating removal. He was down as removal agent. These continued employment, it continued post-removal. It gave him a position as interpreter within 4 U.S. agents and gave him connections that he was going to need following removal. So he's acting as removal agent. Beyond that, Jones took some of the money that he had made from selling Choctaw land, traded that in Vicksburg for enslaved people, oxen, and supplies that he would need to rebuild. He then immediately turned around and rented the slaves and the oxen to the United States government to facilitate removal. One of the enslaved people died in the process, and Jones then demanded the money to repay his investment. When I looked at all of these sources, what became clear is that even if the above story about a mysterious benefactor and $1,000 was true, it was a very small drop in a very full bucket that I don't think Jones wanted circulated after. Now, the other part of this is Jones also suffered mightily in removal. He shared in every hardship. He ended up taking the trail twice. In one of them, he was in charge of one removal group, a party of about 200 people. He also had 400 horses that he was in charge of driving. He said that he lost half of those horses in the coldest winter that he ever experienced from exposure and a surf feed of corn. He also, if you're not familiar, James McDonald took his own life in the wake of removal. It was closest family that Jones had. He had married prior to removal. We know that his wife removes with him, but their child dies either en route or shortly after arrival, which is definitely connected. So understanding these aspects of somebody who both profited and suffered, I think gives a more nuanced perspective on removal. I think that Choctaw peoples who definitely noticed, wait, how does he have a store and money right away? They did not notice it. They also saw his shared suffering, and that was his penance. In this, I don't see him as definitely not hero, but not villain either, but instead somebody who's trying to walk this difficult middle path. There's Peter Pitchlynn, who wrote a poem, Well Removing. Jones has a verse within that poem. He says, Robert Jones is in our crew. This is a man who is true. Which in fairness, I think he was just trying to rhyme with crew, but I think the message still sticks. Move forward. Within 2 decades of arriving in Choctaw Nation Indian Territory, there'd be regular travelers who went through. And the frequent stop is that you stopped at one of Jones's, if not multiple of Jones's properties, and saw his plantation empire. A lot of these travelers, as they took in the cotton fields, the palatial mansions, they kind of struggled to understand what they saw. And you can understand their struggles. How could this amount of wealth and power stand so soon after just calamitous losses of removal? They would have known that even the structures that these were built on, it took generations of wealth to accumulate rather than just a few years. Jones's homes were basically alluring sites in a place where nothing so grandiose should exist. There are some that talk about visiting Lake West, just outside of Idabel, and they talk about the beautiful home, the orchards. They always mention the status of the working out buildings. The facilities are always like, they want to emphasize that. They then go to Rose Hill afterwards. This is the images that you see up here are of Rose Hill. It burned, so we only have so many pictures. There's another that's a model where somebody constructed a little 3D model from memory. But when they went to Rose Hill, you could see that Jones spared no expense decorating the interior or the exterior. You had tall colonial columns made from materials imported from England, adorned 4 porches with transoms over a front door. The main hall had elaborate oil paintings, an Austrian chandelier, books on hardwood bookshelves, the finest grand piano in the region. Each main room had a different type of wood and furniture imported from France, and one record said Japan, which I'd love to know more about. The family and distinguished visitors used this elaborate floating staircase to access their rooms, while a hidden staircase was used by servants and enslaved people. Outside, there was a native marble walkway that led from the veranda steps along with a lawn filled with rose beds and elaborate orchards till you would get to a fenced-in deer park and a flock of peacocks. Jones, often dressed in his finest New Orleans suits, would chauffeur around guests in his grand horse carriage. The question that they asked, how did he do it? How did he turn around losses from removal so quick to get this wealth? Now, part of it I've already told you is that removal became a little bit of a financial boom, but there's more to it than that I investigate in some detail. He had this business pattern of using investment, expansion, diversification, and leaning on communal land holding. He invested capital from removal and started putting up supply stores and storage depots pretty much right away. One of his first ones was at Scullyville, where he knew Choctaws would be arriving, and he knew this is where they would be getting annuity money, and so that they could spend it in his stores. So he was very strategic. A lot of these stores ended up right on the Red River. He would use profits from this to purchase enslaved people and have them clearing lands at various different places, leaning on communal landholding so that he could have multiple land plots that he was using at once. Then to increase his profits, cut losses, he kind of tried to simplify the system by having his own shipping business. He would export his crops on his steamships. He would also go through Indian territory and buy up supply goods that Choctaws and others had produced. So things, honey was one of the common ones. And he would buy those, and then he'd go and sell them in New Orleans or Shreveport, turn around, buy all the goods that he needed from New Orleans and ship them back up, controlling his shipping costs and keeping his stores full. Simultaneously, he knew that he needed partners. He knew that he needed to pool capital in order to grow. His biggest partner was probably his second wife, Susan Colbert, but we'll get to her. His vital business partnerships included Americans, a French-Canadian trader that he incorporated with to become one of the most powerful traders in the Southwest. At the pinnacle of his wealth, he owned 3 steamships on and off, the humbly named R.M. Jones, another one for his daughter Frances, multiple large plantations in the Choctaw Nation, and possibly a sugar plantation in Louisiana. It's mentioned a lot. I can never find it. I can never pin down where and if it is. And around a dozen chain stores. I've seen a number as high as 29. I've only ever found 11 myself. He held personal investments as far north as Wisconsin in a concrete company, east in Philadelphia through a son-in-law that he had working for him, as far south as New Orleans. One of his stores with his partner, John Phelps, was right on in the French district, and as far west as El Paso. He built a regional brand as this affluent, capable Choctaw entrepreneur, which was a seeming contradiction for many in this post-removal nation. But if you focus just on his seeming rags to riches as it's put out story, what you lose out on is changes within the Choctaw system in general and the ways in which communal landholding assisted Choctaws who were wanting to go a more entrepreneurial route. As this new history of capitalism was written, so many, as soon as they saw the word communal for land, they just take that as everything being communal and shut down looking at indigenous peoples. What I look at and say is Jones actually had a considerable advantage over many of his American competitors based on the landholding, the tax structure, and other things within the Choctaw Nation. This map here just kind of shows his plantation locations and the locations that I found for some of his stores. Finally, an empire that slavery built. More than anything else, both his contemporaries and historians alike know Jones for the number of people that he enslaved. The precise number is impossible to know. Years after emancipation, over 100 people who were either enslaved by Jones or family members of those who were testified in front of the Dawes Commission. They asked them, how many slaves did Jones have? And their answers were a heap, a substantial amount, hundreds, loads, but never precise. Even Jones himself didn't know the answer. He testified in 1872. He speculated, I suppose, between old and young, big and little, around 350 to 400. On the high end, historians regularly list Jones as owning 500 or more than 500. If that estimate was accurate, which it's not, but if it were, it'd make him among the largest slaveholders, not in Indian Territory, in the entire United States. The low end that we often see is the 227 that are listed on Schedule 2 of the 1860 census. The United States went into Indian Territory to do a census of enslaved people and US citizens, and Jones is down for 227. But whether it's around 250 or 500 or somewhere in between, I would say that the exact number is not really all that consequential. Any number in that range afforded Robert and Susan tremendous financial wealth, capital, and social status. So in this picture you have here, this is Robert and Susan, his second wife. I love this picture. I once showed it to a class and somebody asked me, like, they had Instagram back then? No, this is how just the pictures looked. Anyway, they married in 1837. Jones's first wife, Judith Walker, died in 36. Susan's first husband had also just died. The Chickasaws were removing at that point to, Jones had partially arranged it to make them essentially a Choctaw colony. And they married in 1837. Susan brought a considerable number of enslaved people to the marriage and maintained ownership over them through 2 decades of marriage. It was clear to those who were on the plantation that they still belonged to Susan. Robert projected this image of the plantation patriarch, but the day-to-day reality was much more complex than that. Susan was still taking actions that were her own actions for enslaved people, including increasing the numbers. Even decades after emancipation, enslaved people had found part of their identity as being traced not through Robert, but through Susan, several of them saying, no, I'm Chickasaw. Robert and Susan were far from the typical slave owners, obviously. They both suffered the brutal consequences of American settler colonialism and then chose to perpetuate one of its cruelest manifestations in racial slavery. It's definitely true. The American nation forced removal of Choctaw and Chickasaws. But it's also true that native slaveholders chose to import chattel slavery and to continue it in Indian Territory. Jones had earned more than enough in his life through his businesses that he could have had a comfortable life without slaveholding, but he definitely made that choice and then authored many laws to protect the rights of slaveholders within the Choctaw Nation, while limiting the rights of free people of African descent. What I tried to do in this chapter is also look within the communities of enslaved people themselves, wherever information that I could find. One of the things that I found is that the Joneses purchased enslaved people everywhere that they could and in various ways. It wasn't just from one place. So as late as 1865, they're still purchasing enslaved people. Sometimes they would do this from local Choctaws who they would buy them from, sometimes in foreclosure. Jones he had a habit of using enslaved people as collateral when he was loaning money to people, and if they couldn't pay back, then he would take the enslaved person to pay back the loan. And this wasn't just for natives either. Various enslaved people talked about coming from white masters and were then purchased by Jones. A couple prominent slave traders had made regular stops within the Choctaw Nation and at Jones's property enough that several knew them by name. They also made purchases in probate sales, a lot of different ways. Some had marched with removal, some made the Second Middle Passage. So we have varying different peoples coming from different places, all ending up on one of these at least 4 large working plantations. I would also argue that the Joneses, because Susan did take his name at least on paper, they very much use slavery and enslavement of others as something of what Ty Miles calls a cultural passport. That among white circles, being large-scale slave owners helped them be among that society. They were subverting expectations, basically. If you went to Rose Hill, if you went to Lake West, as so many travelers did, not only would you see natives with large amounts of slavery, Jones and Susan, they hired white overseers. They also hired whites to do some of their domestic work. So what you would also see is white people who were going to natives for their daily bread, reliant on natives. Looking through this, reading these travelers' accounts, I have to admit it's easy to sometimes look and see the glamour, the notoriety of the Jones and almost get into this Moonlights and Magnolia. But historians really shouldn't be so blinded by this. If you're looking from the perspective of the enslaved, you would also see that their life was essentially living in labor camps, subject to the threat of and the reality of physical and sexual assault, potential sale, constant oversight, limited recourse. Still, they found ways to form communities. They found ways to form families and lasting family bonds. They found ways to resist their enslavement in everyday actions, including a plotted rebellion at one of Jones's plantations, and through legal struggles as well. I'm looking at my time, and I'm a little bit past where I wanted to be, so I'm going to be just very, very brief on Jones's sphere of influence. You can find him everywhere, is what it comes down to. Locally, he's regularly on the Choctaw Council. He writes a good amount of laws, many of them pertaining to education and land rights of Choctaws, while still very much protecting communal land holdings. Education, it's clear that he took an active interest in education and the orphan fund throughout his life. He took on the title Esquire and regularly practiced law, sometimes among outside groups, the community of Delaware who were living within the Choctaw Nation, but a lot of times in Choctaw probate disputes, his name comes up as Esquire. Regionally, struggles with the Republic of Texas, but also he acted as something of a diplomat in some struggles with natives in the Republic of Texas, but also property disputes. Internationally, in 1937, it's Jones who's one of the negotiators, who's negotiating the position of the Chickasaws within the Choctaw Nation. He also has a very unexpected role in the Seminole Wars. This is why when I look at his final titles, I find him listed down as basically chief and general. It's like, how did he become general? We find it in there that you can ask me about later if you're very much interested in. But okay, so going forward into the Civil War, where we find him again. Jones had actually quit. As he said, I quit dabbling in the Indian politic about 5 years before the Civil War broke out. He hadn't really, but officially he had. Till in May of 1861, he made a dramatic reappearance. He stormed into a special meeting of the Grand Council, or the General Council, excuse me. Knowing that he had no right to speak, he still commandeered the floor. He knew that Principal Chief George Hudson was going to call for neutrality of the Choctaw Nation, hoping that the U.S. would finally pay out the net proceeds payments, saying it's none of our fight. Instead, before he could, Jones called for a Confederate alliance, saying that every man who is not with us should be hung up to the first limb between heaven and hell. Either Hudson was intimidated or swayed by his words. He stepped aside and said, nope, we should have a Confederate alliance, and he called on Jones to lead a delegation to make that happen. Now, the usual accounts of this are ones that you might expect. I mean, why did he get involved? The largest slaveholder wanting to go on the Confederacy side? Most of the time, we see this as a small minority of Choctaw slaveholders had tremendous coercive sway over the Choctaw Nation. In one account, Jones is listed as the leader of, quote, a selfish and shriveled minority who forced a wrong decision in the eventual destruction of the 5 tribes. It's a pretty damning indictment. And on the surface, it does seem logical. He is the largest slaveholder. He would have a lot to lose if slavery were to disappear. But also if the South were to disappear, that's most of his markets right there. And only months earlier, he had broken up a rebellion on one of his plantations, which most blamed rebellions in the nation on northern expansion, northern aggression. Nonetheless, if you look at the Choctaws themselves, unlike most white Southerners, they rarely talk about expansion of slavery as a rallying cry. I don't think slavery alone necessarily explains it, nor does the alleged coercive power of Jones. If it's not coercive power of a few, others look and say that it was the caught between two fires, a line that a Choctaw veteran wrote in his own diary. The outside pressures from the Confederacy, they had no choice. Again, there's some logic within that, but as Clarissa Confer aptly notes, Natives weren't pawns or victims of white actions, not merely. Whether right or wrong, decisions were made by Native peoples. Far from helpless, Natives mainly used a Confederate alliance as a way of potentially righting past wrongs. Now, this was a pragmatic choice, one that definitely blew up in their face. There's no doubt about it. No one would look and say, well, that went really well. But what we can see is that it's more than just this usual account. Jones himself, and I know I'm fast forwarding through some of this, when Jones was asked about this at Fort Smith when peace is being reestablished between the Choctaws and the U.S. government, Jones was head of the delegation, and he was asked to give an opening statement. And his statement was so inflammatory, the delegation actually asked if they could take it back. They said, no, but you can give another one. And part of what Jones' statement said is, quote, the Choctaws were not parties to the late war for the purpose of sustaining the institution of slavery, but took sides with the South, believing that to be the only mode by which they could maintain their occupation, rights, and interests to the soil of the country that they now occupy. As I've written about before, the Choctaw cause existed independently and alongside the Confederate banner. And Choctaws zealously and skillfully defended it against other threats, be they Union or Confederate, throughout the conflict. The image that you see on your left here is an image of the surrender. This is the one that most people who ask about Natives in the Civil War, they ask about the final general Stand Watie to surrender. What they don't normally realize is that he surrendered in Dokesville in the Choctaw Nation, and that the American commander had been staying with Jones for a week before. Jones had convinced him to stay in the area to wait for Watie to come through. Jones was almost certainly there at that surrender, and I have some thoughts on that come out of the book. Okay, destruction of Reconstruction. Well, you regularly see Southerners howling and crying crocodile tears over supposed radical Reconstruction. Jones and fellow Choctaws, as well as Natives in general, actually did face some what would be considered radical measures, complete with the full threats of Northern but also Southern carpetbaggers. One of the few things that there was unity on in Reconstruction between North and South was the desire to extort additional resources from Natives. It's one of the reasons why tribes that supposedly that stayed more loyal to the Union actually fared worse than those who stayed loyal with the Confederacy. But what I will also point out, and what I push back on, is this idea that Jones had been broken in Reconstruction. He really wasn't. If you look through this image that's here is an image of a mansion that he built following the Civil War in Paris, Texas. Now, like his other ones, this also ended up burning. He adjusted to free labor quite quickly and relatively easily. He continued serving on education committees. But what happened that held back, why Reconstruction became so damaging for the Choctaws, is that what had been called an irony is before the Civil War, right before, the Choctaws were firmly divided over constitutional matters. They set the divides aside and they found a peaceful solution. They avoided a civil war. During the Civil War, they were very much united. It was in the aftermath of this where Choctaw leadership very much divided. Charges of corruption, bribery, self interest, suspicion ran through what had been longtime friends and leadership figures. Jones himself only missed out on charges of potential bribery because in the peace conference that took place in Washington, D.C., Jones had to leave early after the IRS had seized a lot of his cotton and were holding it and shot his overseer and were holding it. Jones got the attorney general to issue a statement saying they had to release it, and so he left early and missed out on what would probably have been a bribe. Choctaw disputes, and I know I'm watching my time, so I'm kind of brushing through this a little bit. Internal disputes plagued the rest of Jones's life. He led one party in which he often referred to himself as General Jones going to war, and what he hoped was saving the nation and putting them back on a path to prominence. By December 1872, he realized that he was getting incredibly sick. Many people talk about how his health was starting to fail. He summoned, it was then his third wife, Elizabeth, and his doctor to give a final will and testament. He tested to his sound mind, his failing health, laid out his plans for his assets. There's rumors that there was another will that never got filed. He tried to divide his property. He knew it would be a complicated case as he held things in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Wisconsin. Still, he attempted to identify assets and pass them down between his children and grandchildren. On February 22nd, he succumbed to his prolonged battle with malarial fever with his wife and doctor by his side. Or, as some would say, was he poisoned? In the afterword, I get into the two kind of key factors here. What ended up happening, the story of how this commercial empire ended up being split and fracturing, the lives lost in the process, how this overlapped with historical developments like allotment. But then also the question of how it is Jones got lost in the lost cause. This commemoration that took place in the 1930s where they built up the stone wall around Jones's grave from stones from Rose Hill and told a story about him that Jones would probably not recognize in a lot of ways, literally putting in stone that Robert M. Jones, delegate to the Confederate Congress, an office he held for a short time and frankly didn't do all that much in. He was a non-voting delegate. He used most of that time to get payback for Confederate supplies. This became his great legacy. Instead, what I focus on is there's an odd thing in which it's really to be expected that historical figures rarely give guidance for historians. It'd be a little weird if they actually wrote out, hey, historians, here's what I want you to write about me. But Jones has a moment where he actually does. He, in a letter that he wrote to Peter Pitchlynn in 1855 about a draft 1855 treaty, Jones berates Pitchlynn about the idea of giving up their sovereignty in the process. And what Jones says is, quote, let it be handed down to future history, to future generations, and prove that the Choctaws are true men and prefer to live and die in poverty, but cannot be bought. To Jones, his own legacy was not his stint in Congress. It was also not allegedly wilting under American opportunistic oppression of Reconstruction like this lost cause narrative often extols, or his inability to adapt to free labor. He would also certainly not want to be remembered for exploitation of Black people and Black bodies who he enslaved and continued to deny rights to upon their freedom, though that certainly should be a part of his legacy. He believed himself to be a hero of the Choctaw Nation, though rapacious in his pursuit of individual wealth, a patriot who faithfully served his people. It's a self-serving account, to be sure. But as one Chickasaw speaker put it to me perfectly, he did a lot of good things, but he was also kind of a bastard. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciate you being here, Dr. Fortney.